Hi, this is Sam Aronow, and today I'm going to do something a little different. Earlier this summer, friend of the channel Useful Charts released a video on the various denominations of Judaism, a video I actually had some disagreements with. Later on, Useful Charts released a revised version of that video which incorporated a lot of audience suggestions, but which I still thought was incomplete and in some places misleading, particularly in the overly narrow focus on American Jewish religious institutions, as well as the exclusion of Jewish streams that no longer exist. But even before either of those videos came out, Matt from Useful Charts invited me to offer a response that would allow me to show a more global, chronological, and detailed chart. So while there were many things I felt Matt's video was missing, there's one element he included that I'll be leaving out, and that's his discussion of Edot. Edda is often misleadingly translated as ethnicity, but should more accurately be translated as regional subculture, as Jews as a whole identify as a single ethnic group. As Matt said in his video, one's Edda can largely be determined by minhag, cultural traditions that exist outside of the bounds of actual Jewish law. Examples of this include the tradition among Iranian Jews of hitting each other with green onions during Passover, the traditional Eastern Ashkenazi prohibition against naming children after living people, and the American Jewish aversion to tattoos. You may notice that these examples of Edot don't necessarily break down into simple divisions like Ashkenazi and Sephardic. They can be more specific, or, like American Jews, they can cut across those divisions. All of this is to say that Edda is actually a very fluid, subjective concept, and one that I don't think is very useful for understanding Jewish belief and practice. To me, including Edot in a history of Jewish religious streams is kind of like showing a history of American political parties that also includes US states. There is some historical overlap in how these two things interact, but they're not intrinsically linked. So I won't be talking about Edot in this video unless it's relevant in a very specific way. Now, you may notice I'm using the word stream to refer to different varieties of Judaism, where one might refer to different types of Christianity as sects, and Matt uses the neutral term denominations to refer to both. Because English-speaking audiences are in majority Christian cultures, there's a tendency to assume that the rules and structure of Christianity apply to all or most religions, and this is something that Matt talked about in relation to Judaism's emphasis on practice over belief. Likewise, I think there's an important distinction to be made between how Jewish streams and Christian sects view each other. Between Christian sects, there are usually significant differences in the foundational beliefs, metaphysics, and structure, to the point that large groupings like Catholicism and Protestantism can fairly be called different religions. In Judaism, there's a general understanding that we're all Jews here. Part of the reason for this is that Judaism is essentially a folk religion for a specific nation of people. Even those who convert to Judaism are being accepted into the tribe, so to speak. And this is why Jews who aren't religious are still Jews. The exception to this is those who join a different religion, but even this can be flexible. There are instances past and present of practicing Jews incorporating Buddhism and Confucianism into their tradition, since these don't technically contradict Jewish practice. Of course, there are also some extremists who consider competing streams of Judaism to not only be separate religions, but to be existential threats. But as we'll see, these kinds of blow-ups are pretty common across Jewish history. While the narrative of the Bible gives the impression that the emergence of Judaism was very clear-cut, generally opposed to Canaanite paganism, and happened very early in Jewish history, historical evidence reveals a very different path. In fact, what we call First Temple Judaism can fairly be called a local variety of Canaanite paganism, with most people in the Kingdom of Judea remaining polytheistic throughout the First Temple period, roughly from 1000 to 586 BCE. Each god in the Canaanite pantheon had its own set of priests, and over time, priests of the god El Elyon, also known as became more and more powerful. So eventually, in the late 7th century BCE, King Yoshiyahu of Judea established the singular worship of El Elyon, though not the singular belief. All the other priestly families, or Kohanim, were given rotating duties in the Jewish temple to be overseen by the high priest, known by the names Kohen Gadol, Kohen Tzadok, or simply by the acronym KUTZ. Soon after King Yoshiyahu's death, Judea was conquered by the Babylonian Empire, who exiled Judea's political class to Mesopotamia, and during this period, two really important developments occurred. First, a military leader named Yochanan ben Kareach led a contingent of Jewish soldiers out of Judea to serve as mercenaries based in the Egyptian city of Elephantine. There they built a new Jewish temple which stood for nearly 2 centuries. What's most interesting about this is that, though it was uncontroversially recognized at the time as a Jewish temple, the Elephantine Jews remained polytheistic while the rest of the Jewish world didn't. See, at the same time the Elephantine temple was being built, the Jewish leadership in exile in Babylon were undergoing a radical theological transformation. One of these exiled leaders, a Jewish priest named Yechezkel ben Buzi, or in English Ezekiel, was probably most responsible for transforming Judaism into a truly monotheistic religion, as monotheism made it easier for the religion to survive outside its native land. Without the temple, Jewish families would often gather to pray, study, or settle legal disputes under the guidance of learned men of the community known as sages, which would eventually become what we know as rabbis. When Babylon, and much of the rest of West Asia, was conquered by the Persians in 539 BCE, many of the Jewish leadership returned to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And at this point we need to talk about the first non-Jewish religion to evolve out of Judaism, Samaritanism. Now, Samaritans exist today in small numbers, and most of them would disagree that their religion is an offshoot of Judaism. They would say that Judaism is the offshoot, and that their religion is a continuation of that practiced in the lost northern kingdom of Israel. The historical reality is probably a mix of the two, and this is something that Matt discussed. It's probably fair to say that the Samaritan ethnic group are indeed a continuation of the ancient northern Israelites, and many stories from the Bible, like Moshe and the Exodus or Dvorah and the Battle of Mount Tabor, are Samaritan in origin. However, knowing what we do about how Judaism evolved, Samaritan religious beliefs and practice very clearly adopted a great deal from Second Temple Judaism, to the point that I feel comfortable calling it an offshoot of Judaism. What makes Samaritanism a separate religion from Judaism is that they have their own version of the Bible, which dictates Mount Gerizim as the site of their temple. Indeed, they still have a high priest who actively performs sacrifices on Mount Gerizim. But a major shift within Judaism occurred after the conquest of Alexander the Great, when Greek culture and philosophy began having an enormous impact on Jewish culture and philosophy. A couple decades after Alexander's conquest, a high priest named Shimon HaTzadik, or Simon the Just, began expounding on this mix of Jewish and Greek ideas, particularly the idea that the human soul was immortal. Some decades later, a protege of Shimon's named Antigonus of Socho expanded on this idea and concluded that, if the soul is immortal, then there must also be a spiritual world which exists separately from the living one. Though it's ambiguous as to whether Antigonus believed in an afterlife, since so little of his work survived. At this point, different students of Antigonus began to form rival factions, not only because of their religious beliefs, but also their political views of how Judaism as a religion should be governed and by whom. The Pharisees, from the Hebrew pirush, meaning interpreter, believed in the immortality of the soul and even incorporated concepts of a vague afterlife transcending the material world. They believed that Jewish law, as laid out in the Torah, was open to interpretation through scholarly judgment and supported the idea that courts of rabbis rather than the high priest should decide Jewish practice. By contrast, the Sadducees were a conservative faction which rejected the immortality of the soul and rejected the idea of rabbinic interpretation, largely seeking to keep social and political power in the hands of the priestly elite. Their name in Hebrew, Hatzadokiim, comes from the traditional family name of the high priests, Kohen Tzadok, though please keep in mind that many members of the priestly nobility were Pharisees. In the deuterocanonical but largely historical book of 1st Maccabees, the Sadducees are depicted as a much more assimilatory, Hellenized faction, but hopefully it's clear by now that both groups were heavily influenced by Greek culture, just in different ways. As Judea fought for its independence, a new system of government was formed, the Great Sanhedrin, which took inspiration from the Roman Senate, as well as Pharisaic ideas about rule by judgment and deliberation, and this led to the emergence of yet more factions. Following a dispute over the succession to the high priesthood, a mystic faction of the Sadducees broke away to form the Essenes, whose beliefs and practices are unclear, The Essenes were always a very small group relative to the Pharisees and Sadducees. As a result, their beliefs and practices aren't well documented, and what little information survives about them from the time is often contradictory. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Pharisees had become so dominant in the Great Sanhedrin that they split into two factions of their own, the House of Hillel and the House of Shammai. Hillel the Elder was a rabbi from Babylon who immigrated to Judea and rose through the ranks of the Great Sanhedrin to become a fierce challenger to the power of King Herod. He's notable for being among the first rabbinic leaders to make a hard distinction between moral laws and ritual laws within the context of Jewish practice, and always considered ritual laws to be expendable if they conflicted with basic morality. His rival Rabbi Shammai wasn't totally opposed to this, but did place a much stronger emphasis on the enforcement of ritual. In the final decades of the Temple, both factions of the Pharisees spun off far more radical factions. When Judea was absorbed into the Roman Empire, a militant faction called the Kanaim, or Zealots, emerged, which absolutely opposed Roman rule and more specifically the Roman method of collecting taxes. A couple decades later, early Christianity emerged, and while the Gospels position Jesus' teachings as being in opposition to the Pharisees as a whole, it's clear that those same teachings take heavy inspiration from the House of Hillel. In 66 CE, the First Jewish-Roman War broke out, and 4 years later the Jewish temple was destroyed. This resulted in an end to all of the non-Pharisaic traditions. Most of the Zealots were either killed or taken to other parts of the Roman Empire as slaves. The Essenes seem to have already faded away on their own, and without the temple, the Sadducees no longer had a power base from which to exist. When the war ended, a rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai reunited the houses of Hillel and Shammai, and the Jewish tradition that came afterward ended up being a mix of the two ideologies, though it leaned more towards the teachings of Hillel. During this period, a consensus emerged that Christianity was no longer a type of Judaism. See, back in the late 30s and 40s CE, a Jewish Christian leader named Paul of Tarsus concluded that, since Jewish law was specifically a covenant between God and the Jewish people, Jews who converted to Christianity were still obliged to follow it, while non-Jews who became Christians weren't. Without the temple, however, the distinction between Jewish and Gentile Christians became sufficiently nebulous that Christianity was declared by the Jewish establishment to be its own thing. Scholars tend to refer to the form of Judaism that emerged after the First Jewish-Roman War as Rabbinic Judaism, but I won't. It's an unfortunate fact that some Christians use this terminology as evidence that modern Judaism has strayed from its original form, and that whichever form of Christianity that they practice is more reflective of ancient Judaism. But if you've been watching this video so far, it should be clear that rabbis of some form had existed and directed the evolution of Judaism for hundreds of years. Even Jesus is sometimes called rabbi in the Gospels. In the century and a half after the destruction of the temple, 2 more Jewish-Roman wars were fought, which were incredibly bloody and genuinely threatened the survival of Judaism. However, after the third and deadliest war, the Bar Kokhba revolt, a leading rabbi named Yehuda Hanassi met and befriended 3 Roman emperors, who ended up giving him the money and protection necessary to complete a compilation of rabbinic law as it existed up to this time, the Mishnah. In the centuries that followed, Yehuda Hanassi's intellectual descendants, the Amoraim, wrote commentaries on the Mishnah which became known as the Gemara, and together both texts made up what is known as the Talmud. However, much as you might hear the phrase the Talmud in discussions of Jewish law, there are actually 2 versions of the Talmud. See, even as far back as the 2nd century BCE, the majority of the world's Jews lived outside Judea, with the largest diaspora populations establishing their own centers of Jewish thought. For the majority of Jews, who by this time lived within the Roman Empire, most communities followed the legal precedents established in the Jerusalem Gemara, composed in Roman Palestine, while the sizable minority living outside the Roman Empire, mostly in Persian-dominated territories to the east, followed the precedents of the Babylonian Gemara. Despite being the stream of the minority, it was actually the eastern stream of Judaism that would end up overtaking the west. In the 7th century, the Roman and Persian empires were both severely weakened by a decades-long war. In fact, the last war they would ever fight against each other. In the power vacuum created by this conflict, the new power of Islam quickly overtook the Middle East, with the later Umayyad Caliphate sweeping west to incorporate the majority of the world's Jews. Under the influence of the Caliphate, the Babylonian Talmud became the standard, eventually dominating the entire Jewish world. However, by the time this happened, two new streams of Judaism were already taking shape. In the 6th century, as part of a proxy war in the power struggle between Rome and Persia, King Caleb of Axum began persecuting the Jewish population of the kingdom, who responded by fleeing into the Ethiopian highlands. During these centuries of isolation, many aspects of Jewish practice were lost by the Ethiopian Jewish community. And when Jewish practices were rediscovered in the late medieval period, they mostly arrived second-hand through Christian missionaries. So the form of Judaism practiced there, known as Haymanot, ended up being very distinct. Remember what I said at the beginning of this video about streams and edot being separate concepts? Well, this is one of the exceptions, as Haymanot was only ever practiced by the Jews of Ethiopia. However, this is no longer the case. Starting in the late 19th century, the Jews of Ethiopia reincorporated into normative Jewish orthodoxy, with elements of Haymanot continuing only as a non-binding cultural tradition, or minhag. So while the Ethiopian Jewish tradition survives and thrives, Haymanot effectively no longer exists. Meanwhile, another major new stream of Judaism emerged. In 760, a dispute broke out between two brothers over which of them should be crowned as exilarch, the hereditary cultural leader of the Jewish community in Iraq. After being imprisoned for refusing to give up his claim, the losing claimant Anan ben David became cellmates with the Muslim scholar Abu Hanifa, who convinced Anan that rabbinic interpretation wasn't important and that the Torah should be accepted at face value. Anan's descendants and students would gradually build this concept into Karaite Judaism, which, while not biblical literalists, do rely on a distinct, simplified interpretation of Jewish law. In their medieval heyday, 10% of the world's Jews were Karaites, but over the centuries, Karaites steadily shrank in number as they relocated to Egypt, then to the Crimea, and finally to the United States and Israel. Today, there are only about 40,000 Karaites, or about 0.25% of the world's Jews. By the 1160s, a fourth stream of Judaism had emerged, which the Jewish explorer Benjamin of Tudela called Epikursim. Now, the existence of Epikursim is only known through Benjamin of Tudela's writings, so all we know about them is that they only lived on the island of Cyprus, practiced a form of Judaism somewhere between Rabbinic and Karaite Judaism, and observed Sunday as the Sabbath rather than Saturday. It's possible that they may have been an offshoot of the Karaites, or possibly even a community of Ethiopian Jews who arrived in the Mediterranean a couple centuries earlier than is otherwise indicated by the historical record. Around the same time that Benjamin of Tudela was exploring the Jewish world, mainstream Jewish thought was on the verge of making its next great leap. Rabbi Musa ibn Maimun bin Ubaidallah, known in Hebrew as Harambam, or in Western languages as Maimonides, served at various points as chief rabbi of Egypt and family physician for the Egyptian Sultan Saladin. Maimonides did way more than is possible to discuss in this video, but his main contribution to Jewish thought were two books that he wrote: The Guide for the Perplexed, which reconciled Jewish and Aristotelian philosophy, and the Mishneh Torah, which systematized Jewish law in order to make it easier to study. Maimonides' work was extremely popular across the Jewish world, but there were those who opposed his innovations, particularly in southern France, where leading rabbis attempted to suppress Maimonides' work by turning it over to Catholic authorities to be burned. Instead, those Catholic authorities responded with a century-long campaign of persecution that would conclude with the expulsion of Jews from southern France in 1306, ending the Maimonidean controversy. Over the next couple centuries, while lots and lots of important developments took place within Judaism, the religion remained largely cohesive across the known world. But that began to change in the Renaissance. In 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain, and 4 years later, those Jews who had fled to neighboring Portugal were forced to convert to Christianity. At the time, the Iberian Peninsula had been home to about 30% of the world's Jewish population, and the ensuing refugee crisis wreaked havoc on the Jewish legal system. The majority of refugees, about 150,000, were invited to resettle in the rapidly growing Ottoman Empire, in communities where they often outnumbered the pre-existing Jewish population. So, whose version of Jewish law held jurisdiction in these communities? That of the refugees, or that of the pre-existing population? The fight over this lasted for the better part of a century. But finally, in 1565, a solution emerged in the form of the Shulchan Aruch. Yosef Karo was a rabbi in the Galilean city of Safed, which, under the stewardship of the Ottomans, had grown to become the intellectual center of the Jewish world. To help his students learn Jewish law, Karo wrote a study guide called the Shulchan Aruch. Because the Ottoman Empire at this time had no printing presses, Karo sent his study guide to be printed in Venice, where it unexpectedly became a bestseller as a guide for Jewish law that would eliminate the existing disputes over jurisdiction. However, the emergent supremacy of the Shulchan Aruch also established a custom that no future legal rulings could contradict it. Until now, it had been perfectly acceptable for new rulings in Jewish law to overturn old ones, since those making new judgments were presumed to have new knowledge that past rabbis lacked. Thus, in my opinion, the custom of the supremacy of the Shulchan Aruch is largely responsible for the intense factionalism that has defined Judaism in the modern era, and thus may be considered the beginning of what we would call Orthodox Judaism. The first factions to break away from this orthodoxy both came about in the 17th century. Back in ancient times, one of the things that made the Pharisees distinct from the Sadducees was their belief in the immortality of the soul. But despite the fact that the Pharisees emerged as the lone surviving stream of Judaism after the fall of the Temple, immortality of the soul and its implications remained secondary to more popular concepts in Jewish moral philosophy that emphasize that moral and ritual actions have consequences in the here and now, which doesn't necessarily require a belief in an active God, divine miracles, or the divine inspiration of the Bible's authorship. Bento de Spinoza was a Jewish scholar in Amsterdam who was censured from the Jewish community in 1656 for expressing these ideas. Due to his embrace of secularism, Spinoza didn't consider himself to still be Jewish, and he died young before his ideas began to creep back into the Jewish world. So he had no idea that his philosophy would go on to form the basis of Jewish secularism, which today comprises the largest share of the world's Jewish population. At the same time, a contemporary of Spinoza's went in a very different direction. Shabtai Tzvi ben Mordechai was a young Jewish scholar from what is now Turkey who was self-educated in the late medieval school of Jewish mysticism known as Kabbalah, and also probably suffered from severe bipolar disorder. Shabtai Tzvi's reading of Kabbalistic texts convinced him that he was a Messiah who would lead the Jewish people into a new age, overturn all the precedents of Jewish law, and eventually become the new Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Though he toiled in obscurity for many years, his ideas suddenly exploded in popularity in 1665. At his peak, it's believed that up to 10% of the world's Jews were followers of Shabtai Tzvi. But the vogue of these so-called Sabbateans quickly ended in 1666, when Tzvi and some of his followers suddenly converted to Islam. A second wave of Sabbateanism erupted in the mid-18th century under a man named Jakob Frank, but this too was quickly quashed when Frank and most of his followers converted to Catholicism. Entering the 18th century, yet another young charismatic scholar emerged in the form of Rabbi Moshe Luzzatto, or the Ramchal. Luzzatto was a pioneer in popular mysticism, modern Jewish ethics, and the revival of Hebrew as a modern secular literary language. He also enjoyed a lifestyle that was far less insular and conservative than that of his peers in the Venetian Republic. In fact, a lot of what he wrote and was written about him reads as queer. Because Luzzatto was already so popular, reactionaries within the Jewish world were unable to prevent his influence. But through his work, it's easy to see the ways in which Jewish thought was straining against the confines of orthodoxy, and this would really start to be felt around the time of his death in 1746. In most of the world at this time, Jewish communities were treated as a separate estate of the realms in which they lived, under the leadership of rabbinic courts with varying degrees of political autonomy. The country in which Jews had the greatest political autonomy at this time was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And a couple centuries earlier, that would have been seen as a good thing. But by the mid-18th century, the rabbinic leadership of Poland had gained a reputation for corruption and authoritarianism, particularly in the frontier provinces of what's now Western Ukraine. In response, many poorer and less educated Jews living in that area flocked not to a rabbi, but to an itinerant preacher and mystic known as the Baal Shem Tov. Under his tutelage, much of the population began practicing an unstructured, improvisational, and emotional form of Judaism that sought to engage with the religion without the monetary, educational, or familial gatekeeping of the rabbis. The term adopted for this form of practice was piety, or in Hebrew, Chassidut, and this was the beginning of Hasidic Judaism. To many Jewish traditionalists, this was all too reminiscent of Sabbateanism, and so one of the leading rabbis of the Commonwealth, the Vilna Gaon, rallied his like-minded contemporaries, not only in Poland, Lithuania, but all over Europe, Asia, and Africa, in opposing Hasidism, becoming known as the opponents, or Mitnagdim. Today, relations between the Mitnagdim and Hasidim are much more cordial, and on this chart, you'll notice that both Hasidim and Mitnagdim are grouped together under the subcategory of Haredim, or ultra-Orthodox Jews. That's because the 18th century also saw the emergence of a third faction which was less religiously radical than the Hasidim, but far more politically radical. At this time, Western Europe was in the throes of the Enlightenment, where ideas of human rights and personal freedom were really beginning to take root. And among the Jews of Western Europe, autonomy as an estate of the realm was beginning to lose popularity in favor of emancipation, a political order in which Jews would be equal citizens of the country in which they lived, with individual rights, free from persecution by authoritarian kings and authoritarian rabbis. The foremost supporter of this concept was a rabbi from Prussia named Moses Mendelssohn, whose renown as a philosopher extended far beyond the Jewish sphere, and is generally considered the founder of the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, which is why he and his intellectual descendants are grouped together as the Maskilim. Mendelssohn died fairly young, so he never lived to see the explosion of Jewish emancipation that took place during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. In a single generation, Haredi Judaism nearly went extinct in Western and Central Europe. Freed from the restrictions of rabbinic authorities, many upwardly mobile Jews of the West began experimenting with looser, more pragmatic forms of worship. With Napoleon's downfall in 1815, Jewish emancipation was rolled back in much of the West, but ultra-Orthodox rabbis were unable to gain back their former authority. In 1819, some Maskilim in the city of Hamburg established their own synagogue which incorporated modern elements like organs, eliminated certain prayers and rituals, and created some new ones, a concept that their disciples in the United States would name Reform Judaism. After trying and failing to shut the Hamburg Temple down, the rabbinic leaders of the city were replaced by a new generation of leaders like Rabbi Isaac Bernays, who, though certainly orthodox, embraced the worldly and politically liberal approach of Rabbi Mendelssohn, and rejected the exercise of political power over their communities, establishing what would eventually be known as modern Orthodox Judaism. But many Reform Jews remained dissatisfied with the outcome of this schism. The changes to ritual and practice at the Hamburg Temple had been very piecemeal and haphazard, without much thought given to philosophical consistency, and over time, many of the Hamburg Temple's innovations were eliminated. More radical reformers, like Rabbis Abraham Geiger and Samuel Holdheim, believed that all ritual was an irrational superstition that should be eliminated, that notions of Jewish nationhood should be abandoned, and that full cultural assimilation should be the end goal, with Judaism surviving purely as a moral philosophy. Their radical reform had a popular start, but gradually declined in popularity until formally dissolving in 1937, its leading rabbis having concluded that assimilation was both unnecessary and fruitless in the face of modern anti-Semitism like that practiced in Nazi Germany. Though I have heard rumors that a few communities of radical reform devotees persist in rural parts of the American Midwest. In contrast to the radical reformers, there were also conservatives in the reform movement who didn't want to get rid of ritual at all. In principle, they agreed with their fellow reformers that Jewish ritual was an irrational practice that lacked material value. Instead, they embraced Jewish ritual for its symbolic value, which put them in opposition to both reform and orthodoxy. Today, conservative Judaism is a rapidly shrinking stream of Judaism, but for reasons unknown, conservative Jews are the largest stream among fans of this channel. For reasons of clarity, I should point out that the term conservative Judaism has no particular connection to conservative politics. In fact, conservative Jews tend not to be political conservatives. In the 1930s, a conservative rabbi in the United States named Mordecai Kaplan began laying out yet another Jewish stream which built on the philosophical foundations of conservative Judaism. To massively oversimplify things, Kaplan argued that because conservatives interpreted Jewish law to be purely symbolic, it wasn't really law at all, but rather a folk tradition that had evolved over the course of Jewish civilization and would continue to do so, and in fact actively encourage new developments in religious practice. Kaplan's stream, Reconstructionist Judaism, is one of the smallest streams of Judaism that currently still exists, but it has introduced a practice that has actually been embraced by most other streams. The Bat Mitzvah, in which adolescent girls are inducted as full members of the synagogue by reading from the Torah, just as boys have traditionally done since at least the 14th century. Finally, starting in the 1960s, religious Jews involved in the hippie trend and other countercultural movements established their own stream of Judaism known as Jewish Renewal. This is probably the smallest stream of Judaism in existence today, and it was honestly kind of hard to research. But to put things simply, it seems to combine the political ethos of Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist Judaism with the mystical and experiential aspects of Hasidic Judaism, as well as an all-around New Age aesthetic. If you're curious to know more about Jewish history, be sure to check out the rest of my channel. And if you want more Jewish history in chart form, check out the 3 posters that I designed for useful charts, which you can find via the link in the description below. I'm Sam Aronow, and thanks for watching. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Jacob Kossoff, Robinson Crusoe, Eric Lederman, Jeffrey Schweitzer, and Ian York.